really essential to effective science communication. So, in full transparency about my own positionality, a little bit of information about me. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the Division of Biology here at Kansas State University. If you went to my lightning talk on Friday, you'll know that I study grass evolution, and if you didn't, I study grass evolution. And when I'm not watching grass grow and die, I'm heavily involved in LGBTQIA+ advocacy, both here on campus and in Kansas in general. And something else about me is that I've been teaching organismic biology lab for 8 semesters now, and it's through my involvement with this course that I started asking questions about how we're talking about biological sex, because while I was teaching, I realized that there were 2 words that I was saying over and over again without really explaining what they meant. And these words were male and female. So, male and female, male and female, female and male, very pregnant male and female, mictic female, amictic female, and male, female-ish ascogonium and male-ish antheridium, male gametophyte and female gametophyte, male flower and female flower. And so as I was saying all of those things over and over again, it brought up some questions like, what do the terms male and female actually even mean when we're using them to describe such diverse and different organisms? How in general do we define biological sex? How do we talk about this? And why does it matter? So I plan to address all of these questions, but before we get to them, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk more about how we're doing science and who's doing science and how that impacts all of these things. So to start as broadly as possible, what's biology? What's our working definition of biology? And there's many options, and I chose to use one from Google Dictionary. So this says, biology is the study of living organisms divided into many specialized fields that describe their morphology, physiology, anatomy, behavior, origin, and distribution. And I want to draw your attention here to the word study, because biology is a system of knowledge, and like other systems of knowledge, it has benefits, drawbacks, and limitations. So the next logical question to ask is, who does biology? And it's not only done by bearded men pointing aggressively at nothing, but as we've heard about already from a couple of the excellent speakers yesterday, structural inequalities influence who gets to be a biology, because in order to be considered a contributing member of the biological community, you need to have access to particular resources and a particular education. And because there are extreme forms of inequality within our society, certain people are much more likely to have access to those resources and that education than others. And that's important because biologists, as they're doing biology, are going to be influenced by and also limited by their own positionality. So let's define that term. Positionality is the social and political context that creates your identity and will influence how you interact with the world and how the world perceives and treats you. And it's not bad to have positionality, but it is influential. So if the group that comprises biologists demographically differs from the general population, then there will be certain positionalities overrepresented in biology. And then that's going to come into play when we see how biologists are sometimes motivated by explicit or implicit biases. So in scientific training, we're taught to avoid explicit biases, or at least disclose them. So if you've read a paper that's talking on and on about how cheese is really good for you, and then you see that it was funded by a National Dairy Council, that would be an example of an explicit bias. And implicit biases might be harder to see, but they can still really influence the science that we do. So for example, if we have a team of scientists who are working to develop drugs to treat diseases, and everyone on that team of scientists is going to be a cisgender middle-aged man, then that group is going to be more likely, whether they know it or not, to choose to focus on finding cures for diseases that affect cisgender middle-aged men. And if all or almost all of the teams of people working to develop drugs share that positionality, then that's going to dramatically skew what drugs are developed and what drugs are available to treat the diseases that people face. So as we're starting to see, this has important implications both for how science is done and for how science is communicated. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about how it influences science communication. And I've organized this part of the presentation in terms of questions, because everyone's positionality is different, so everyone's answers will be different. So in terms of how our positionality influences our science communication, I think we need to ask ourselves questions like, what are my identities that I'm showing up with that may be visible or invisible to other people? What identities do I share with my audience? What is the power differential between me and my audience? What are my biases about my audience, both biases that I'm aware of and biases that I might need to dig a little deeper to figure out? What is my relationship to the material I'm communicating? Is it my research done by someone I know, or just something I care a lot about? What ways of knowing am I validating and invalidating through my science communication? What are my values in selecting the content that I'm communicating? And then ultimately, which bodies, identities, behaviors, beliefs, and experiences does my content imply are normal or abnormal, valid or invalid? And so the other half of this relationship in science communication is going to be audience. So I think we have another set of questions we need to ask ourselves about our audience. So what is the age of our audience? Is it really young people? Is it college students? Is it older adults? Are we teaching people who are very familiar with this material, or people to whom it's entirely novel? What are the audience's backgrounds and identities? What are their goals and their relationship to science? And if we don't know, can we ask? And what are the potential biases that our audience has, both towards us as scientists and communicators, and towards science itself? What are the goals of our communication? And how might our positionality and that of the audience influence how the communication goes? And in addition to looking at how our positionality as scientists influences our communication, I think we also need to consider how it influences the way that scientific knowledge is created. So variation is inherent in nature, but as soon as we begin doing the scientific process of observing, manipulating, and categorizing, that introduces subjectivity and bias. Because we as biologists are subjective, but we're in a position of power because we have the tools of science and the permission to do science in order to create categories and decide what's a logical category, and then classify organisms according to the categories that we've created. And not only do we make classification decisions, but we also make value decisions. So what do we think is the ideal within a certain category, and what perhaps is an example of something that is too ambiguous to fit within the categories that we have? So there's a quote by Karen Levy that I think reinforces this nicely, and it says, "The act of measurement is not neutral. Every technology of measurement and classification legitimates certain forms of knowledge and experience while rendering others invisible." So now I want to talk about how that relates to biological sex classifications, especially in terms of how biological sex is frequently taught to people who are not scientists. So people who do not choose to go into science will probably get their last exposure to biology either in a high school class or an introductory college class. And frequently the perspective on biological sex that they'll get from this type of course will be something like this. So we have a sperm that's carrying either an X or Y chromosome uniting with an egg that has an X chromosome, creating either an XX female or an XY male. And so that's going to be sex. And thinking about this in what we call a life cycle diagram, that's going to be contextualized with an XX mother and an XY father doing an act of heterosexual reproductive-oriented sex to produce offspring. And that may seem pretty straightforward and perhaps all the information that a non-scientist needs to know about biological sex, at least as it pertains to humans. But I would argue that we're saying more than we think we're saying when this is the only story that we're telling about biological sex. The story that we're telling is a story that's about sex, which is binary. But we're also starting to tell a story about gender because the terms mother and father are gendered words. So we're seeing gender being created by sex, and from a feminist perspective, gender and sex are not the same thing, but there are many people who see them as the same thing, or either see sex because it's biological, as either more real or more valid or in some way inherently foundational to gender. And so we're also going to see gender is binary and gender created by sex. And then if we're thinking about this life cycle diagram and how we're getting from one generation to the next, there's only one way that we're showing that happening, and that's through a certain version of sexuality. And I did not come up with this. This is coming from something called the conflation triangle, which is from a 1990s paper published in a Berkeley Law Journal, and it's showing us how legally and also to some extent scientifically it's very hard to talk about sex, gender, or sexual orientation without them all having implications for each other. So if this is the model of biological sex that we're teaching students, it's also providing a model of gender and a model of sexuality, where heterosexuality is both obligatory and the only version of sexuality that we're biologically validating. So if you're a scientist whose positionality fits well with this, you may have never questioned why we teach biological sex this way so often and whether there's potentially any harm in doing this. But if you're somebody whose positionality does not match up with this, then you're going to leave that biology class thinking that your experience of sex, gender, and or sexuality is not the one that's validated by science and is therefore less biological and maybe even less okay than other versions. And that can lead us to people who think like this, which is annoying. And it can also lead to things like this. So I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but in October of 2018, the Department of Health and Human Services leaked a memo to the New York Times, which proposed that key government agencies need to adopt an explicit and uniform definition of gender as determined on a biological basis that's clear, grounded in science, objective, and administratable. The agency's proposed definition would define sex as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with, and any dispute about one's sex would have to be clarified using genetic testing. So I see this as both an extreme conflation of sex and gender, and also very dangerous because it's weaponizing a misunderstanding of biological sex to invalidate and endanger a lot of people with whom we share this society. And the fact that they're appealing to science to support this false claim is very troubling to me, both as a scientist and somebody who would be personally affected if this proposed memo became law. So, why does this matter? It matters because how we teach and communicate biological sex influences also how we perceive gender, sexuality, and gender roles. And this influences us in terms of how we do science and how we interact with each other every day. And for some people, this literally impacts their access to legal rights, medical treatment, and life chances. So people for whom this does not work, and especially people who are intersex, transgender, and non-binary. And these people are in our lives, and in our classes, and in the communities that we're communicating with, whether we know it or not. And when we think about how students receive the science that we teach and how people hear the science that we communicate, if they're not seeing themselves validated, and especially if they're seeing science made their enemy and weaponized against them, those people are not going to support science and not want to do science, and therefore their very valuable perspectives will not be used in the process of creating science. So I think if we want to change this and do things differently, we really need to examine our relationship to scientific accuracy, complexity, and uncertainty as science communicators. So because I don't like to tear things down without at least trying to build them back up, the rest of the presentation will be some suggestions of how we can do this better. And most of the examples I give are examples that I've used at queer and trans conferences to talk about this to people who are not science and have primarily experienced science as being weaponized against them. So these are my suggestions from my experience, and there's other ways to do this too. But just to give you some ideas, I think we need to really emphasize that biological sex is complicated and it varies widely across taxa. And not all organisms have sex, and that's fine. Not all organisms have separate sexes, and not all organisms with sexes have two separate sexes. So we even see things like sequential hermaphroditism organism, where in some species it's typical for an individual to be different sexes during different periods of their life, or if there's a change in the social composition of the group. And if we're going to talk about biological sex, I think we need to conditionally and explicitly define it. So I got this from an online medical encyclopedia, and it talks about how in most plants and animals, our concept of biological sex is going to come from gametes. So then we can define gametes and talk about why we separate egg and sperm. It has to do with size and with mobility. And I like to talk about how the egg is bigger because of all the extra goodies that it has. And then once we know where we're getting this idea of biological sex from gametes, then we can talk about how do we get gametes. So we need organisms that produce them. And we can either do this in a monoecious manner, where we have a single organism that produces both eggs and sperm. I use a house because monoecious literally means one house. Or we can have dioecious organisms, where we need a separate individual to produce eggs and then to produce sperm. And this is where we're getting those terms, male and female, that I was saying over and over again in organismic biology. And if we're looking at organisms that are dioecious, then let's talk about how we figure out who's going to make eggs and who's going to make sperm. And there's a couple different ways to do this. So environmental sex determination, which can be temperature sensitive or something else. Social sex determination, which is wild, like this limpet, where if a larva hits the ocean floor first, it will become a female. And if it hits a female first, it will become a male. And then what we're probably going to personally be most familiar with, depending on what our study species is, and what our students will likely be most familiar with, which is chromosomal sex determination, so XX, XY, ZZ, ZW, XXX, etc. So then we can talk about karyotypes, which are really fun, and point out that we have these autosomes and also these sex chromosomes. But I don't want to end the story there, because dioecious does not mean binary. And especially when it comes to humans, the way that biological sex actually works and the way that we perceive biological sex in society are very different. So biological sex is actually, in humans, a collection of variable traits that are either directly or indirectly related to reproduction. And so we have primary sex characteristics, or things that you're born with, and this is going to be our famous chromosomes, and how our brain and body develop prenatally, including our internal and external reproductive structures. So the stuff that leads to this. And while primary sex characteristics are diverse, it's usually just one that's going to result in our social assignment to a certain sex category, which is the length of the lovely external structure that we call the phalloclitoris. And we also have secondary sex characteristics, which are things that we develop at puberty, like facial and body hair, body size, vocal range, and the shape and fat distribution of our bodies. And when we're interacting with other adults, maybe we're using their secondary sex characteristics to make assumptions about who they are, but usually we just assume that a person's gender expression is a so-called honest signal of biological sex characteristics. And oftentimes people get confused or angry when their assumptions about gender did not lead to correct assumptions about biological sex, which is something that we need to interrogate. And something that I think we need to talk about in every conversation about human biological sex is intersex. So not everyone is XX or XY. There's lots of other combinations of sex chromosomes that are possible. And we also should remember that you can be XX or XY intersex because there are genes on non-sex chromosomes that influence sex development. And I like to give a definition of intersex. And one that's pretty useful is from the Intersex Society of North America, and it says intersex is a variety of conditions in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to quite fit the definition of male or female. And by this definition, that's about 2% of the population, so to contextualize that, that's about the same percentage of people who globally have green eyes. And if you remember the slide with the shells on it, when we make decisions about how to define and categorize phenotypic variations, those are always subjective decisions. And there's a lot of social pressures that make people who have power want to define intersex as narrowly as possible. And there are alternate definitions, such as this one by Dr. Carrie Gabrielle Costello, which says intersex could mean when a body does not fully differentiate into male or female, which is a much higher percentage of the population, potentially as much as 10%. If you want to talk more about this alternate definition and why I think it's an important conversation, come talk to me after. I don't have time to go over it now. So when we talk about intersex, I think it's really important to emphasize that this is an part of human biological variation, not something that's a mistake or something that needs to be fixed. So, some general guidelines to leave you with about biological sex is to be specific when defining and using biological sex. Use gamete-focused language instead of sex or gendered language when possible, so we can say egg-producing tissues or sperm-producing structures. Provide examples of variation in different parts of the reproductive process, especially if we're talking beyond humans, because there is a lot of variation and it's fascinating. And we don't talk about that. People think that the way that humans do it is the only or the best way to do it, which is very incorrect. And when we are talking about non-human organisms, avoid gendering them or gender stereotyping their motivations or the style of their behaviors. When we are talking about humans, remember that reproduction through sex or heterosexual sex is not the only or ultimate goal of having a body, of having sex, of having gender, of having sexuality. And then finally, touching back on that discussion of biological sex and intersex, diversity in sex development exists. Almost every component of the sex development process has the potential for variation. And talking about this without either pathologizing or objectifying people who are not living in bodies that were born clearly defined as male or female. So hopefully what I'm leaving you with is an understanding of how we don't need to talk about biological sex like this when it actually looks more like this. So this is an infographic from Scientific American. It's awesome. You should look it up. And with that, I'd like to really thank you for listening. You're welcome to email me. I can send you the slides. We can continue this conversation. I got Twitter recently. You can follow me on Twitter. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments in whatever time we have left. Joel?
So in focusing on like gamete-producing tissue or organisms, does that not or in following someone's like general public, oh, so if I produce an egg, that means I'm a female, that means I'm the mother, are we still not enforcing at least some sort of like binary gender stereotype even though we're talking about what they produce? Or is that something, or is there a better way to kind of cut off that connection that if I'm saying like egg-producing tissue, it does not necessarily mean like female?
I think that's an excellent point. Did everyone hear Joel's question? Okay. So I think that we can talk about the difference between a conversation about sex and a conversation about gender. And additionally, I think that's a great time to emphasize the variation in biological sex. So some people don't have any gamete-producing structures. Some people are born without gonads, or some people are born with what are called ovotestes. So you have some sperm-producing and some egg-producing tissue. So do those people not get to have gender if their gonads are ambiguous? So getting rid of this binary and deterministic connection between certain physical structures and an inherent category. So I like to think of the gamete-producing structures as part of the collection of biological sex influencing characteristics. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Maybe I have time for one more question?